Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining and Happy New Year. You know, 2024 was indeed a remarkable year. And it was the year when, for the first time, the field of artificial neural networks has been recognized by the major Nobel Prize in Physics. So you all know that it has been awarded to John Hopfield and Geoffrey Hinton for their pioneering work in the field of artificial neural networks. And today I want to tell you about a class of models that are called dense associative memories. As you will see, dense associative memories are heavily inspired by the celebrated Hopfield networks of associative memories. But it turns out that in certain computational aspects, dense associative memories are actually superior to the conventional, traditional Hopfield networks. And in my talk today, I'd like to explain what dense associative memories are, why some people are excited about this class of new models, and what kind of interesting AI applications and perhaps theoretical models of brain computation one can build using these new ideas. So that will be my plan for today. I want to begin this talk with a broad definition of what, in general, an energy-based associative memory is. So the problem here is the following. Imagine that someone has given me a bunch of data points. And think about data points as some very high-dimensional vectors. So you can think about them, for example, as images encoded in some high-dimensional space. So all my network, all my computation will live in n-dimensional space. And in this cartoon example, let's imagine that we have four data points, Xi1, Xi2, Xi3, and Xi4. By the way, you can see my mouse when I move it, right? Okay, perfect. Yeah. So essentially, we have four data points, four Xis, and each of those Xis is an n-dimensional vector. So essentially, when what we're trying to do here is the following. We're trying to design a neural network that has some synaptic weights, that has some parameters. And we want to choose these parameters in a way so that this neural network can memorize these four vectors in the pattern of its synaptic weights. So this neural network that I'm going to discuss is a heavily recurrent neural network. So it's a very different kind of neural network that, conventional 99% of deep learning is using. So it has a very strong feedback. And the most important aspect of energy-based associative memories is that they have this notion of the energy function. So essentially, one can conceptualize the computation of this neural network as dynamics of this red ball that is located somewhere on this sophisticated energy landscape. And when this network is doing computation, the red ball moves down the hill along the energy landscape. So the computation will stop once the ball reaches one of the local minima. The local minima are called memories. And the reason why they are called memories is because you can essentially think about this whole process of dynamical relaxation of this ball from a high energy state to the final fixed point as the process of memory retrieval from the synaptic weights of this neural network. And and essentially, like the typical kind of use cases that people use for the typical kind of problems that people use this network for solving are pattern completion task and denoising. To illustrate what this means, imagine that my vectors are images. And let's imagine that I initialize my network in a state that corresponds to the image that is shown on the left. This image, and essentially the way this image is constructed, I took some high resolution image and I removed 3/4 of that image. I occluded those pixels. Now, each neuron in this, little demonstration would correspond to an RGB channel of that image. So if I'm gonna let this network do the computation, hopefully you will see that as the dynamics of this red ball proceeds in time, as the red ball rolls down the hill, the energy landscape, the neural network manages to recover the missing parts of that image and reconstruct a nice image of the bird. And that's what we call the memory retrieval. So essentially, like the whole bird serves as a memory, the initial beak of the bird serves as the initial state or a cue, or sometimes we call it a prompt. And then the neural network retrieves the whole pattern from its synaptic weights. The reason, by the way, that this idea is called associative memory is because essentially this nonlinear dynamical system associates the initial state where this ball is located at the moment of time t equals to 0 in the final state where this ball ends up being located in the limit of time t goes to infinity, one of the local minima. So that's one typical task how energy-based associative memories are used. Another commonly used task is the task of denoising. In this task, we also start from some initial state, and a typical state is shown here on the right. It's some noisy version of the pattern. But the computation is very similar. So we give that noisy version of the pattern to this neural network. And as you can see, as dynamics progresses in time, the network manages to remove the noise and reconstruct, the closest memory, which in this case corresponds to the bolt. And essentially, the important ideas, the important aspect of this computation are the following. That first of all, this computation is highly collective. And what this means is that the computation is not done at the level of individual neurons or at the level of individual memories, but rather it is done at the level of the whole network. And in order to visually illustrate this, I'm gonna drag the slider for this last video back and forth. And hopefully you can see that in the background of the boat, at some point you can see a shadow of the same bird that is located on the left. And that is exactly the collective aspect that I'm trying to illustrate here. So essentially, it's not just the network picks the closest memory. The network is exploring the, the space of all possible neuron configurations and all possible memories. And somewhere along this dynamical trajectory, it's not just the bolt, which is the leading memory that attracts the state of the neural network, but also subleading memories play the role in computation. And the example of a subleading memory here is the image of this bird. And when I called it this simulation, I think I put about 10 images into this neural network, and you can't really see all of them, but they all contribute in a collective fashion to the final answer that this neural network is giving to us. So another important aspect of this idea is the idea of distributed computation. And what this means is that we can take this network and we can mutilate it in quite severe ways. So we can take individual neurons and we can deactivate them. We can kill them entirely. We can kill some of the connections, some of the synaptic weights in this neural network. And despite these manipulations, the neural network would still be able, in up to a certain degree, to do the same kind of computation that it has been initially designed for. So that's the aspect of distributed computation that was also an important idea that made Hopfield Networks a success back in the 80s. Now, after this high-level definition, let's dive in a little bit more mathematical formulation of what Hopfield networks are and how people typically think about them. A possible way to think about conventional classical Hopfield network is the following. You can imagine a binary n-dimensional space. So essentially imagine that you have n elements, capital N elements, and each of those elements that I'm going to call neurons are denoted by this variable sigma I. Index I refers to individual neurons, so it runs from 1 to n. And the possible values of each element sigma I are equal to +1 or -1. You can think about this biologically, for example, as whether or not a given neuron I is in the off state or whether or not that neuron fires an action potential. That would be one possible way to think about it biologically. So the energy landscape for this network is defined by this formula that is shown here on the left. And as you can see, the shape of this energy landscape is encoded in this symmetric matrix Tij. So essentially, that's the only parameter of the network that defines the energy landscape. The matrix Tij in the most conventional setting is computed from the memory vectors. So remember, in the previous slide, the problem was set in the following way, that you give me a set of memory vectors and I design the energy landscape. So here the memory vectors are denoted by these letters xi. And as in the previous slide, the upper index in this letter xi represents the identity of the memory. So for example, mu equals 1 corresponds to the bird from the previous slide, mu equals 2 corresponds to the boat, etc. And there's also this vector index I that runs from 1 to n that enumerates neurons or projections of the memories into the embedding space. And essentially, what one needs to do in order to compute the energy landscape is to compute this matrix of outer products between all the memories and sum those outer products across all the memories that are given to us. And that would be the matrix Tij. Now, what Hopfield and others in the 80s realized is that this model works as a very nice model of energy-based associative memory, but only up to a certain point. So you can keep loading this network with a lot of memories. So like here, you can see that I have tried to write capital K memories into this network. And it turns out that up to a certain threshold, this network will indeed be able to retrieve those memories that have been encoded in the synaptic weights of this neural network, but only up to a certain threshold. And it turns out that if you exceed the threshold, which is equal to 0.14n, where 0.14 is some numerical constant that comes from some statistical physics computation, and capital N is the size of the network, once you exceed that threshold, then the network starts making mistakes. And essentially what happens, instead of retrieving a bird and a boat and something else, it retrieves some kind of, blobs of color, some states that in physics we call spin glass states or spurious states. And essentially, at that point, the computation breaks. So the bound 0.14n derived under very severe and strict assumptions that the memories are binary and random, and they are drawn from a certain kind of distribution when each element xi mu I is equal to +1 or -1 with equal probability. But it turns out that you can somewhat relax those conditions, and by doing so, you can play a little bit with this coefficient 0.14 in front of the linear scaling. But it turns out that as long as you stay within the class of these energy functions that are quadratic in sigmas, there is no way that you can beat the linear scaling relationship of the capacity as a function of the size of the network. Now, for someone who works on designing novel AI architectures, it turns out that this limitation is extremely annoying for a whole bunch of reasons. Let me give you one reason. Imagine, for example, that we are trying to solve a very simple task. Imagine that I'm a Japanese person and I want to learn kanji characters. So here in the bottom of this slide, you can see a few examples of kanji characters digitized on a pattern of 64 by 64 pixels. So if we believe that this bound is correct, and that's the largest amount of information that this classical Hopfield network can work with, then we would immediately need to conclude that the maximum number of memories that this network can store is, roughly speaking, to 0.14 multiplied by 64 squared, which is about 600 memories. And it's a very simple task, right? It's not like, we are doing things like large language models or anything too sophisticated. All that I'm asking to do this network is to, take a bunch of images, memorize them, and recall them. And it turns out that this simple network cannot solve even such a very simple task. And that's a bit of a, that's somewhat, unsatisfactory, right? Because clearly, if we talk to an educated Japanese person needs to know about 2,000 kanji characters, and they, can recognize them in all kinds of orientations, all kinds of, little variations of how you write them. And we don't even ask that kind of complicated task. We just want to retrieve those examples, and the network fails. So clearly, there is some kind of discrepancy between this simple mathematical model and what we would like, an intelligent AI system or biological neural networks to do. So a few years ago, we started thinking about how we can surpass this annoying limitation, but we didn't want to go after this 0.14 coefficient in front of it. We wanted to go after this scaling relationship. And it turns out that a bunch of no-go theorems that has been proven in the 80s about the linear scaling capacity of this network, they essentially rely on this quadratic structure of this energy function, that essentially you take sigma I multiplied by sigma j, and you put some coefficient that kind of, indicates how you contract those speeds. So in order to understand what dense associative memories are, let's slightly remassage this classical Hopfield network in the following way. So let's take this definition of the matrix Tij, plug it into the definition of the energy function, and rearrange the sums. I'm just going to move to my next slide and rearrange the sums over the indices I, j, and the memory index mu. And if you do that, hopefully you can see that you can rewrite this energy function in the following simple form. So essentially you take the dot product between the state vector sigma and each individual memory, and then you square that overlap, and you sum that overlap over all the memories. And that's my energy. So now imagine that instead of squaring that overlap, we would pass it through some very rapidly growing function f. I'm going to specify what that function f will be in a second, but let's imagine that this function grows faster than quadratically. For example, it can be x to the power n, where n is an integer, and imagine that little n is bigger than 2. So it turns out that what the mathematical phenomena that would happen then is that the leading memory would be much more strongly emphasized compared to all the sub-leading memories when we do memory recall. And for that reason, the neural network would be less prone to confusing the leading memory with the sub-leading memories. From the physics perspective, what has happened when we went from the left to the right, something quite interesting happened, because notice that if this function f is, for example, cubic function, you can technically go do a trick and go back from this representation back to a representation that looks like this one. You can essentially evaluate the sum with respect to the index mu. And then what you would see that the energy function essentially becomes cubic in sigmas. So it's no longer quadratic, it's cubic. And if you're coming from the physics background, you kind of know that the quadratic systems are relatively straightforwardly analyzed in physics. Of course, still a very nonlinear system, but quadratic systems are way, way, way simpler than non-quadratic system. And that's kind of like a bit of an intuition that you might get from this comparison of these two models on the left and on the right. Now, it turns out that if you repeat pretty much the same computation that has led us to the conclusion that the capacity of the classical Hopfield network is 0.14 n, but in the case of dense associative memories, you would see that for the power function f, the capacity now scales like a power law. So essentially it scales like a size of the network raised to the power n minus 1, where this power n is the highest degree of the power that appears in the definition of the energy function. So when little n is equal to 2, we of course recover the familiar linear scaling relationship. But for n which is greater than 2, the capacity scales much faster with the size of the network than in the classical Hopfield network. Moreover, it turns out that you can even achieve an exponential storage capacity in this network. So for example, if you pick the function f to be an exponent of x, you can achieve up to square root of 2 to the power n memories being reliably stored and retrieved in this dense associative memory network. So indeed, kind of like these new models, they are in a sense much more capable in terms of information storage compared to the classical Hopfield networks that are built on quadratic interactions. Now, of course, when we try to build AI system, when we try to do some kind of deep learning, we don't want to work with binary variables, because we presumably want to train networks using backprop. We want everything to be fully differentiable. And for that reason, it's highly desirable to make sure that these results about exponential or very big memory storage capacity, they do not disappear if you go from binary variables to continuous variables. It turns out that by now there is a very well-established theory around dense associative memories that admits both description of binary networks and continuous networks. And essentially, in order to go from binary description to continuous networks, what one needs to do is to replace these binary Ising-like spin variables with continuous time-dependent variables xi of t. And one needs to replace discrete spin flips that lead to the minimization of the energy with a dynamical system. So essentially, we're going to write something like dx dt on the left-hand side of the equation. And we're going to write some synaptic weights w and some nonlinear activation functions g on the right. But by and large, if you look at these kinds of equations, they are, pretty reasonable models that kind of, not unlike the firing rate models in neuroscience. What is somewhat special about them is the choice of the activation functions, because these activation functions, some of them need to be sufficiently aggressively peaked around memories. And that's something that I'm going to discuss a little bit later on in my talk. So essentially, the point here is that this simple intuition that holds for binary dense associative memories to a certain degree can be extended to continuous variables. We can study the capacity of these networks, and the capacity can be also made exponential. And there is a very nice theory how one can design Lyapunov functions, dynamical equations that lead to minimization of those Lyapunov functions, and quite sophisticated architectures in this class of continuous dense associative memories. I also want to say that when we do deep learning typically comes with all kinds of interesting inductive biases that are suitable for working with certain data structures. So for example, when we work with images, we typically like to process them using convolutional neural networks. When we work with text, we typically like to process it using attention mechanism or some form of transformer architecture. There is also an emerging field of diffusion models that I'm sure many of you have heard about, that is a whole new paradigm that can generate quite realistically looking images and data from other modalities that mimic the distribution of the original data sets. So there are all these exciting developments in AI that are happening today. And it turns out that all these inductive biases that we like and value so much in conventional deep learning can be incorporated into the framework of dense associative memories. So what it means is that you can design a neural networks with feedback. Like look at this picture, for example, that is shown on the right. It's not a feed-forward convolutional neural network because there are these arrows that pointing from the higher layers back to the lower layers. So it's a network with a ton of feedback, with a very, very heavy feedback from top layers all the way to the input layer. So it is an example, and that network has an energy function. So you can write a global energy function that kind of governs this whole computation that this network is doing. But at the same time, this network has convolutional layers. So in that sense, and it also has all these nice properties of being able to store more memories than the simple quadratic network of similar structure. So it is a form of dense associative memory. It's a form of energy-based model, and it's an extension of a Hopfield network, if you wish. So it turns out that you can do the same thing with the transformer. So you essentially can take the conventional network motifs that people use in large language models and many other exciting AI applications, and you can tweak them a little bit so that they comply with the existence of the global energy functions. And it turns out that you can derive those energy functions using certain formalism that I don't have time to discuss today. And you can build quite sophisticated AI architectures based on these ideas. I do want to dedicate most of my talk to talking about the brain and neuroscience, but I don't want to leave you with an impression that everything that I have described so far is, some kind of funny mathematics that could be interesting for maybe theoretical physicists, maybe even for computational neuroscientists, but not really for state-of-the-art AI research. And in order to kind of, not to leave you with this impression, I do want to very briefly show you a couple of systems that we have built using these ideas. So let me show you this one. So this is the architecture that we call the energy transformer. So the energy transformer is a form of a transformer. And as I'm sure you know, transformers are the technology behind all the excitement behind large language models. So this transformer is trained on images. And essentially, the way it is done is the following. It's a form of dense associative memory. You design this architecture with the global energy function, and then you feed a ton of images into this architecture. The task of this architecture, however, is not to memorize individual instances of those images, but abstract some kind of general rules about how natural images are constructed. So examples of rules could be, for example, if you show me an image and there is a left portion of a human face, there got to be a right portion of that face, and that right portion should be properly located. It should have the right size. It should have the right skin color, etc. So how can we design a network that does something like that? Importantly, once the network has been trained, it should generalize to completely new images, to images that come from the same distribution, but images that the network has not seen during training time. So I'm going to show you how this network works on these images. And again, I want to emphasize that the images that you see in the slide are novel, that they have not been used in training. So the network is seeing them for the first time. In the right way to read this slide is the following. In the third column, you can see the ground truth image. So that's the image from the test set. In the first column, you can see the image as it is given to the energy transformer at the moment of time t equals to 0. And in the second column, this one, you would see how how this energy transformer or dense associative memory kind of evolves this image in time with the goal to match the target, the ground truth image that is shown in the right column. So let me play this movie for you, and please pay attention to the second column. So this architecture is unfolded in time for 12 time steps. And after it reaches the last 12 step, the movie jumps back onto the first slide that you see. That's why you see some discontinuity in this movie. But hopefully you would agree with me that this network indeed has learned meaningful representation of what a set of naturally looking images might look like. So for example, if you focus on the boundary like right here, at the boundary between the background of this dog and the fur, the ear of that dog, you can see that despite the fact that most of that boundary has been occluded at the initial moment of time, the dense associative memory manages to smoothly interpolate and kind of reconstruct a nice boundary between the green background and the fur of that dog. The reconstructions are very far from perfect. So for example, if you focus on this portion of the image, you can see that the ground truth is irregular patterns of bricks. But because some of the boundaries between those bricks were occluded in the initial seed, the network manages to reconstruct a very long brick instead of a regular pattern, which of course is a deviation from the ground truth, but it's a meaningful deviation. It doesn't kind of do something completely crazy here. So indeed, this network, being presented with a sufficiently rich data set, manages to learn or memorize certain rules about how images are constructed. A different example of a similar architecture, we used it for physical simulations. So here you can see some solutions to sophisticated Navier-Stokes equations, some hydrodynamic flow. And in the left column, you can see the ground truth solution, which is a result of numerical simulations. In the middle column, you can see what has been given to this network at t equals to 0. And in the right column, you can see the output that this network manages to predict. So this is a much simpler problem compared to the problem of natural images that you had seen in the previous slide. But still, it's a very nonlinear differential equations with partial derivatives and time dependence, etc. And hopefully you would agree that indeed the prediction that this neural network manages to arrive at is quite meaningful and indeed matches very nicely the ground truth solutions to those equations. So let me stop with AI applications here, and now let me talk a little bit about biology. So let's go back for a second to the classical traditional Hopfield networks. So as we already discussed, in the case of binary networks, we can write them in this way, with the tensor Tij that couples to the product of two spins or two neurons, sigma I and sigma j. Or we can write it in this form, which essentially I compute the overlap and I square it. And it's exactly the same formula. Now, let's try to do something similar for dense associative memories. And let me pick the function f to be a cubic function for simplicity. So if the function f is cubic, hopefully you can see that if I compute the sum over this index mu and I introduce this tensor t now with three indices t, I, j, k, which is defined this way, I can clearly write my energy in this form. So essentially my energy would be a product of sigma I, sigma j, and sigma k, and that product would be contracted with the tensor with three indices t, I, j, k, right? Now let's think for a second about what this means biologically. In the conventional Hopfield interpretation from back in the 80s, one would interpret the coefficient Tij's as the synaptic weights between neuron I and neuron J. And that makes perfect sense because neurons in biology talk in pairs, right? There is a presynaptic cell, there is a postsynaptic cell, and there is a synapse that stores the information in between those. Indeed, there is a bit of a problem here with biology because there is a weight transport, right? So the synapse between neuron I and neuron J has to be equal to the synapse between neuron J and neuron I. And that is unbiological. But at least the synapse connects two neurons. In the dense associative memory, naively, if we interpret the coefficients Tij, as synaptic couplings, we would need to arrive at the conclusion that, in fact, the synapses, they are many-body. They are not two-body synapses. They connect three neurons. Now, imagine that I go from a cubic function to a function of power 5. Then I would need to connect 5 neurons together. If I go to a function with the power 1,000,000, I would need to connect 1,000,000 of neurons together. And that's, of course, something that neuroscientists are, and quite reasonably are uncomfortable because, neuroscientists would tell us that that's unbiological. Because in biology, most of the neurons are two-body. So how can we resolve this problem? It turns out that there are at least two theories of how this puzzle can be resolved. So there is a theory that I'm going to call theory number one. And that theory tells you that, in fact, both theory number one and theory number two tells you that the right way to think about dense associative memory is as effective theories. So microscopically, they are described by slightly different kind of equations. But once you integrate out certain degrees of freedom, you arrive at an effective theory, and effective theory would have these many-body couplings. The difference between theory 1 and theory 2 is that in theory 1, these many-body couplings arise after integrating out of neuronal degrees of freedom. In the theory 2 that I'm super excited about, and I'm going to tell you about it in a moment, requires you introduction of non-neuronal cells. And particularly when we talk about brain anatomy, I think that there is a very nice and very appealing class of cells that are called astrocytes, that are glia cells, that are non-neuronal, but they have a lot of the right properties that make them quite natural candidates for biological implementations of these many-body couplings. So let me start with theory 1. So according to this theory, what one needs to do is the following. up until this point, we only had feature neurons in all my slides, and they have been denoted by these blue circles. So the blue circles are still here, so we'll still have feature neurons. But now, in addition to the feature neurons, I'm going to introduce a new class of neurons that I'm going to call memory neurons or hidden neurons. And I'm going to couple them to the feature neurons in the following way. And this coupling is very much in the spirit of restricted Boltzmann machines, which were also the subject of the Nobel Prize of 2024. So essentially, the blue guys would project onto the green guys, and the green guys would project with exactly the same weights back onto the blue guys. So I'm going to work in the continuous time and space here. So I'm going to write the time-dependent differential equations here. And essentially, the variable v here represents the internal state of the blue guys, of the feature neurons. And the variable h represents the internal state of the green guys, or memory neurons. There is also a firing rate for both blue guys and the green guys. So the firing rates for the green guys are denoted by the letter f mu. And in general, that function is allowed to be a function of all the neurons in the hidden layer h mu. So it does not necessarily need to be an element-wise function. Typically, in neuroscience, when we write a nonlinear function, we say that it's a sigmoid, but that sigmoid depends only on the activity of one neuron. And that is fine. So these equations allow that setting, but they allow a much broader setting when this function f can be something like a softmax or a layer normalization. And that allows you to not only use these equations for the purposes of computational neuroscience, but also for the purposes of various interesting AI applications. So the point here is that you can write these equations, and they are reasonable equations. So essentially, the minus vi is the standard decay term, minus h mu is also the standard decay term. II is the input current that flows into the feature layer. And these two terms, this one and this one, are synaptic couplings between the green neurons and the blue neurons. Now, please notice that the equation for the hidden neurons is linear in h mu. And what this means is that I can actually solve it. I can assume that the neurons, the hidden neurons are so fast and they equilibrate extremely quickly. And I can take the limit tau h goes to 0. And if I do that, I can solve this equation for h mu, and I can take that solution and I can plug it back into the first system of equations. So kind of, graphically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to exclude these green guys from these equations, and I'm going to arrive at an effective theory constructed only for the feature neurons, for the blue neurons. And it turns out that if I do that, I will end up having these many-body couplets. So that's what I mean that dense associative memories, in the way how we thought about them 5 years ago or so, the right way to think about them as effective theories. But at the same time, microscopically, they could be implemented with only two-body connections between the neurons, but at the expense of introducing a whole bunch of auxiliary hidden neurons. Right? So that is one interesting way of thinking about this network biologically. Now, let me go to theory number 2. And in order to introduce this idea, let me state the obvious in this community that not all brain cells are neurons. So a typical human brain contains, roughly speaking, 85 billion neurons, and roughly speaking, similar number of glia cells. Glia cells are electrically silent. They do not produce action potential. And typically, if you talk to mainstream neuroscience communities, they're typically thought as support structures. So they feed neurons, they clean garbage after neurons. But many people would argue, not everyone, but many people would argue that they are unlikely to do interesting computation. So at the same time, they have a very interesting anatomical structure. And by the way, the reason why, so there is a large family of glia cells. And within that family, there is a special subfamily of cells that are called astrocytes. And I'm going to focus on this special cell type. And the reason why they're called astrocytes is because they have this characteristic star-like morphology. So they were first described by this gentleman who was a German physiologist. And he noticed that they're so ubiquitous in the human brain that they kind of, hold the whole brain structure together. That's why he thought that they serve as glue. And that's why he called them glia. And again, the word astrocyte originates from the Latin word astra because of this characteristic star-like shape that you can see under the microscope. So what is so interesting about these cells? Several things. First of all, a single astrocyte, astrocyte form what is called tripartite synapses. So in conventional neuroscience 101, we think about synapse as a thing that connects the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. With a little bit extra level of complexity, we need to recognize that almost all synapses in the brain have a process wrapped around them. So the process is this long tentacle that comes out of the soma of the astrocyte. So all these tentacles are called processes. And essentially, each process wraps around a distinct synapse. So for example, this synapse is a synapse that connects neuron 1 and neuron 2. And there could be a different synapse connecting neurons, say, 38 and 55, that is wrapped by a different tentacle, different process. But these two tentacles or two processes belong to the same biological cell, to the same astrocyte. So astrocytes do not produce action potentials, but they can exchange calcium. So there could be a calcium ion flow between this process and this other process connected by the same cell. There could also be a bunch of other molecules, various kinds of kinases and molecules that are different from calcium ions, but can also carry some meaningful information from one process to a different process. It is fairly well established biologically that processes can sense the concentration of neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft. And that means that conceptually, the information can flow from neurons to the processes or to the astrocyte. It is also well established that astrocytic processes can modulate the strength of synapses. So they can amplify the strength of synapses, or they can make the strength of synaptic connections weaker. And by doing so, they can dynamically reconfigure the structure of the neural network as it is doing computation. So if you take all those ingredients together, it is very tempting to hypothesize that it is possible to imagine a direct information transfer between this synapse and a different synapse connecting two entirely different neurons, mediated by this, astrocytic cell. So the information can travel not through the neural network, but rather can travel through the soma of this astrocyte. And that information can be carried by calcium ions or various kinds of other biochemical molecules. Let's stay agnostic about that for now. So my colleagues and I, we try to formalize this idea in the form of simple equations. And what we've arrived at is a simple biochemical model that essentially contains three variables. The variable number one is the activity of a neuron. So we have n neuron, each neuron has an index I, and the activity of that neuron is denoted by the variable xi. There is also a variable Sij that describes the strength of the synapse between neuron I and neuron J. And that's also a valid dynamical variable. It depends on the activities of the neurons. It can also depend on the state of the astrocyte. And the last variable that is used in this theory is the variable Pij. So the variable Pij stands for the process that wraps around the synapse Ij. So it's a property of the astrocyte. And essentially, in the left-hand side of these equations, you can see time-dependent, time derivative of all these variables. And in the right-hand side of the neural equation, you can see something that looks somewhat familiar. So it's essentially a firing rate model. So phi of xj is the firing rate of neuron J. There is some function of the strength of the synapse Sij. and you know, that thing, you know, tells you how neuron J communicates with neuron I. There are also some nonlinear functions that appear in the second and third equations. And we spent a substantial amount of time talking to real, you know, astrobiologists, glia biologists who work with these cells. And we try to design these functions in a way that they make a certain degree of biological sense. But what is interesting is if you take now this theory seriously for a second, and you integrate out the synaptic degrees of freedom and the astrocytic degrees of freedom, what you will end up having is an effective theory for neurons only. And it is possible to pick the nonlinearities in the right-hand sides of these equations in a way so that you can reproduce quite a broad class of dense associative memories. So essentially what is happening is that this astrocyte, it connects to a bunch of neurons and a bunch of synapses. And if you imagine that there is an information transfer going mediated by this astrocyte, what you can do, you can take that astrocyte and you can integrate it out mathematically from this theory. And as a result of that integration out, you get an effective theory on neurons only. And that theory would have the structure of dense associative memory that allows large memory storage capacity and many other desirable properties. So I think that I should probably conclude soon because the talk is only 45 to 50 minutes. So let me stop here and let me jump to the conclusion. So essentially, dense associative memories is a very interesting class of models. It's not just one model. It's a class of models that have a certain degree of freedom in terms of what kind of nonlinearities you can put in the right-hand sides of these equations. Some of these dense associative memories end up being quite helpful for various AI applications. Some of these dense associative memories might be helpful for certain ways of thinking about neurobiology. Dense associative memories can be both binary and continuous, and there is a reasonably well-developed theory of both kinds of descriptions of these networks. Neuron-astrocyte networks may serve as a very appealing biological hardware, so to speak, for implementing dense associative memories in the brain. You can certainly implement dense associative memories without astrocytes, but in some sense, astrocytic implementation is in certain ways more economical and more beautiful than purely neuronal implementations. And lastly, I want to briefly state this because this is a neuroscience community, and I hope that some of you are actually experimental neurobiologists who have experience with calcium imaging and all the fancy experimental techniques that can be applied to kind of thinking about these ideas and perhaps even testing them experimentally. So if for a second we literally take this mathematical theory, which of course can be entirely wrong, but if for a second we believe that indeed there is an information transfer mediated by the astrocyte, this theory would predict that there is a very specific set of targeted experiments that one can do by disrupting that information transfer. And it would predict certain outcomes that could be on memory storage, memory retrieval, that could be tested experimentally. So if you are an experimentalist and you have experience with calcium imaging, I would be extremely happy if some of you got excited about these ideas and you could consider and perhaps think about this proposal. So I'm gonna stop here. Thanks for listening.